Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out today with Joti Brar. Let's talk. Uh-oh. I guess we're not talking. We can't get our countdown in. Well, that's okay, Joti. It will within a few. Okay. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and it's Tuesday morning, so we're hanging out with Joti Brar. And Joti, I feel that something you have been doing has taken hold. Looky here. Support for capitalism at a new low. Gallup. All right, let's go. Just more than half of U.S. adults in a new survey say they support capitalism, a record low since Gallup began asking questions 15 years ago. 54% of Americans say they have a positive image of capitalism when asked to give a response just off the top of your head. That marks a 6% decline when 61% of Americans had a positive. To hear them talk, you'd think it was 100%. Let's go a little further. Capitalism, everything's down. The latest survey also asked about public perception of socialism, which saw 39% support overall, 66% from Democrats, and which is shocking, 14% from Republicans. So things are going up now. I'm not sure why. Who knows? I think it's Joti Brar's work, but let me show you something that may have another impact, that may be impacting the subject. This is a picture of Los Angeles, California. Here's what I'm thinking. That may be the impetus for the change. If you're living in a shanty town of disease, poverty, and filth, you may look at the circumstances that have created that and say to yourself, I don't like this. Perhaps there's another way. Joti Brar, your thoughts?
100%, Garland. Now, in Britain, we don't have quite such in-your-face evidence of the housing crisis, but we have a housing crisis which is just as bad as the one in the States. Huge numbers of people in Britain are put into what is called temporary accommodation, but can last for years and years because there's nowhere to move them on to. They could be single people, they could be whole families, they're chucked into little rooms. It's a bit like with the kind of asylum seeker setup. It's actually a massive scam for a section of the ruling class. These landlords, corporate landlords, are basically given carte blanche to charge what they want to accommodate these people in the most horrific conditions. And the government gives our tax money to those corporations, those corporate landlords. They charge huge astronomical fees, and what they deliver is appalling. Many women in those kind of places have suffered abuse or even rape. Same with children, because it's totally insecure. There's no protection for them. They've got no rights there. They often can't get moved on. So we have this horrific situation where the housing crisis is getting worse and worse. But in Britain, the ruling class is a little bit more subtle than the American ruling class. And they have worked out that keeping it off the streets is a better way of keeping social peace. And they found a way to incentivize, monetize it for the rent-seeking class, turn it into a way to get more cash out of the treasury and into the pockets of the super rich. But it's a horrific sight, isn't it, Garland? And we often talk, don't we, about the post-World War II, the Keynesian consensus, as it was called, that brought us in the imperialist countries, brought us welfare states to stop us from demanding socialism. Now, the reason that the people were so revolutionary at that time is because they had endured in the space of 30 years, the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, which I recently heard Radhika Desai describe as the long crisis, right? Basically, she talked 1914 to 1945 was one great big capitalist crisis, and that, in fact, is a good description. So they had endured those 3 decades of absolute misery, and where the working class, even in the richest countries, including Britain, which was at that time the richest and most powerful imperialist country on the planet, there were working class kids in the winter without shoes. There were people going hungry. There were, people starving on the streets, literally. So they had endured a huge amount. And I think what we have to recognize is what things look like for the workers in the early part of the 20th century across Western Europe and the USA. That is capitalism as normal. We had this weird post-World War II situation where the living conditions of the workers in every sphere of life were raised up. And as a result, it was a big bribe to stop us from making the revolution. But as a result, we kind of had our folk memory reset. And we now think that what we had after 1945 is what's normal. We think that's the baseline, and we see it going below that as outrageous. Now, of course, it is outrageous because we are capable of providing much better for everybody. But under capitalism, it's very abnormal for the mass of the workers to all have houses and jobs, right? That's never how capitalism has been. And there's a pamphlet I would ask all of your viewers to go and look for. It's by Friedrich Engels, who was one of the founders of Marxism, along with Karl Marx. It's just called The Housing Question. And it's a brilliant explanation of why it is that capitalism cannot solve the housing crisis. And fundamental reason why the housing crisis cannot be solved under capitalist conditions is that under capitalism, housing is a commodity, something to be bought and sold. Pardon me. And that being the case, what that means is you can only have a house if you've got the money to pay for the house. And under conditions of capitalism, lots of workers will not have the money to pay for a house or even to pay to rent a room, right? That is the reality of how capitalism works. We've talked lots of times, haven't we, about how the system of capitalism sucks wealth from mass to the super rich, and it's a constant process. So the more time goes by, the more we have this phenomenon, and it's a global phenomenon. Remember, it's not just in one society, it's across the world. The mass of the world's people get poorer and poorer, and there's more and more of the poor section of the population. And the rich at the top, there become fewer and fewer of them because capital concentrates, but they become richer and richer and richer and richer, and it becomes utterly obscene. And we see what we're seeing now. And there's lots of people saying, oh, well, this is terrible. What we need is to tax the wealthy. And you can see why they think that that's the answer, because it's blatantly and obscenely unfair. And we need some money to be going back the other way, that's for sure. But the problem is, if you don't change the basis on which society operates, i.e., if you leave capitalist production relations in place, if the basis of your economy is still producing commodities for profit and for the market rather than for use by people according to a plan, you are creating the conditions that create the problem. You're perpetuating the conditions, that create the problem. And without addressing the conditions, you can't solve the problem. And that really needs to be understood by people, Garland, because we've had a good 200 years of reformists in the Western imperialist countries trying to find ways to tinker around the edges of the system to make it fair, to make it deliver for working people. Many of them have been extremely well-meaning. Many of them are just state plants who are there to direct our attention and keep us hoping and praying for change, right? For a change within the system. But the point is, sorry, my dog going.
He's so excited about what Joti's saying. That's what it is. The dog's so excited about what you're saying. Even he had to chime in and say, yes, revolution. That's dog language. He means revolution.
That is exactly what she means. So anyway, as I was saying, if you're not addressing the root causes, you don't fix the problem. And we see that. That is why, despite the fact that after World War II, we had this temporary situation of reversing this problem and building houses and saying to the workers, no, housing is a right for everybody. That changed. Well, you never had that in USA, but we had it here in Britain, and there in other imperialist countries they had that after World War II. But how long was the ruling class able to keep that up for, that pretense that they really cared about the working class? They started selling off council housing, Garland, in this country in the early 1980s or mid 1980s. So you're basically looking at maximum 4 decades of this kind of special situation. And essentially, the special situation had to be reversed. Why? Because the system of imperialism, capitalist global capitalist imperialism, had remained in place after World War II, everywhere except for the socialist camp. And what that meant in the Western countries, even though they'd done all of these, what seemed like socialistic reforms, the basis of the economy was the same. And the World War II construction boom, reconstruction of all the things they destroyed, came to an end at the end of the 1960s. And from that moment onwards, you started to see across the Western economies, across the imperialist economies, cuts to welfare spending, reversals of all of the gains the working class had made, attacks on organized labor, because it's the unions that front up the struggle of the workers to defend what they've won. Okay, so the big battles in every country to destroy the trade union movement so they can ramp up their attacks on the working class. And we've had a steadily accelerating attack on working class pay, conditions, social services, and every other kind of welfare and state provision from that time forwards. And an increasing need of the capitalists to turn everything possible into a vehicle for taking profits. So increasingly now, we've talked about this before, haven't we? What we see is money that goes into the treasury from taxes, which we think we're paying for the services we get. What we're really paying for is the ability of a whole load of privateers, profiteers to loot the treasury in the name of delivering some service or other that they may or may not deliver. But whatever they deliver, it's like 1/10 of what it used to be for 100 times the price, right? So this is the situation we see now. And we really, I think, Garland, we see these horrific sights. We hear we read these horrific statistics, and we hear the most horrible stories of the plight of people who are the victims of this for no fault of their own, that they're it's there, but for the grace of God go I, isn't it? You have to recognize that it's luck of the draw if you manage to be in a position where you can afford housing or you're not. And anything can happen to anyone at any time that takes what they thought that was their comfortable position away from them, right? If you're a wage slave, you're only ever a couple of pay packets away from destitution in this system, right? We're not secure in the things that we might feel comfortable about. And it's only a little knock in life can bring that, really bring that home to you. I know 2 middle-aged men, who are quite local to me, who I've met for different reasons, both of whom found that through divorce or separation from their partner, and with kids and all the rest involved, they suddenly found themselves homeless. And they're right at the bottom of anybody's list to help or deal with because they're single men. They've worked all their lives, they had homes, they had families, the relationship broke up, and suddenly they're totally destitute, right? This is the financial situation. It can be anything. I know in the States you have people ending up homeless because they get a medical bill. And we look at that, we stand here in Britain and say, oh my God, how could anybody let that sort of thing happen? But we're heading in that direction ourselves also, Garland, step by step, all the preparations are being made, and we see the next step being prepared that takes us inexorably to the place where the Americans or the USA population already is, right? And this is the result of capitalism operating as capitalism operates. And we really need to learn our lesson about them, don't we, Garland? And stop jumping up and down for fair housing and start jumping up and down for like a revolutionary change.
One of the things that I was wondering about was your thoughts on the relationship between these crackdowns that are coming on. We see Trump, hey, we're going to send troops to the street in all of these major cities. We see France now. Apparently, Macron went to the hospitals and said, "You must prepare for lots of bodies coming for a war with Russia." But yet they know the military says we can't go to war with Russia. We can't send troops with Russia. And Macron's kind of like, "Shh, don't tell anybody that." And I'm thinking, your government's collapsing and you're going broke. I don't think you're preparing the hospitals for troops from Russia. I think you're preparing them for, a complete and total unrest in your country when your people find out that things are collapsing. Okay, so we see the Trump team, or the U.S. government, we got to send troops to the streets. We see Macron, we got to prepare for perhaps bad things happening in our society where there's injuries and deaths. And we look at what's happening in the UK. I mean, if you so much as, spell out the word Palestine, and, if you were a child were to take their building blocks and spell out the word Palestine, they'd probably be arrested at a child's school for that. Complete crackdown on anything that has to do with Zionism. Your thoughts on these internal crackdowns?
Absolutely, Garland. Well, there's two separate things I'd like to deal with there, if I may. The first one is this drive towards militarizing the police and militarizing society. I think it serves two functions, both of which are related to the global economic crisis. One is, as you rightly said, and for decades they've been doing, just like for decades they've been privatizing and profiteering from all public service provision, they have also been, across Western societies, imperialist societies, they have been taking every opportunity and every justification to militarize the police and justify it to people with all kinds of excuses. Oh, it's because of the threat of terrorism. Oh, it's because of the threat of this, that, and the other. It's because of immigrants. It's because of, you name it. Actually, you're absolutely right. They're gearing up the police to be able to fight the home population, to crush dissent, to crush rebellion. They know better, I think, than most workers know that rebellion is surely coming, that the revolutionary mood of the masses is going to lift as the crisis deepens and the war drive accelerates. And we can see that starting to happen in small ways across the imperialist countries. And that's just the beginning of what's in store as the economic situation and the wars all get worse. So you're absolutely right. That's not an accident. And, it's not always for the reasons that are given. Immigrants in the USA are not, we've talked about it lots of times, they're not the reason you've got crime. You could get rid of every single person who was born outside of the USA. You think you'll have got rid of crime that way? Just stop and think about it for a second, and that's lunacy, right? What is it that drives crime? One thing that drives crime is poverty and inequality. And another thing that drives crime is simply the fact that we live in a system that rewards it. Right? I mean, the biggest, we talked about this last week, didn't we? The biggest bosses of all of the most horrific crimes that are carried out in working class areas and against the masses of the people at home and abroad, the biggest bosses of all of those crimes, whether it's terrorism, drug running, pimping, child trafficking, whatever it might be, the biggest bosses of all of those and the ones who ultimately profit from it all are the imperialists. They're people in very nice Ralph Lauren suits in the city of London and on Wall Street. So if you are angry about that kind of thing in your neighborhood, that's where you should be directing your rage, not at poor immigrants who are being held up to you as the bringers of crime into your community. And it's total fabricated nonsense. So that was the militarization of the police, yes. And of course, there's a militarization of society generally, because whether or not they're able to deliver on this bit of the war immediately against Russia, there is a need for the imperialist camp to be more militarized and more on a war footing in order to put as much resource as possible into fighting Russia, China, and the anti-imperialist world generally, whether that's Venezuela, DPRK, Cuba, Lebanon, Yemen, wherever, Palestine, Iran, all of it is a target. Of course, China is the ultimate target, but we've seen that the way the ruling class hopes to get to China is to cut off as many of its allies as possible first. We've seen the same way they tried to do with Russia, that they want to light fires all along its borders. They want to cut off its fuel supplies. They want to cut off its trade routes. So they're lighting fires everywhere. they're ramping up for more and more wars everywhere, but they're also preparing the home population that if necessary, we're ready to be part of the cannon fodder machinery. They prefer to have proxy armies, but they need also to prepare the people at home to at least accept all the terrible things they're doing around the world and make us feel that, we're in this existential war that we have to kind of buy into. We have to, for example, we need to accept the diversion of funds, even more diversion of funds from delivering services like education and healthcare into waging wars. And that is increasingly being made explicit to people. Actually, we need much more money for NATO and all of the war machinery than we used to have. So we're just going to have to cut back even more draconian on even more things. And remember, this is a situation where we're in another long crisis, aren't we? This crisis, entered a very deep phase in 2008, and it's just been getting progressively worse since then. So we've been having brutal austerity and brutal attacks on working conditions and pay and pensions and all our service provisions since 2008 in Britain, and across most of the imperialist world, I think it's the same. And so we're already in a really immiserated position. We're already in a position where most of our social services and service position have been cut to almost nothing, or cut to something where they're so small that they become pointless, because essentially you have to be so sick or in such a bad way to deserve attention by anybody. So for example, to get mental health help, you have to basically be, suicidal, or to get physical, to get up an operating list, you have to be like nearly dead. And what does that mean? Essentially, that these services become very top emergency triage zones where they're almost what they're delivering is too little, too late. The intervention they could have made and should have made 2 or 3 years earlier to help that person actually recover and have a decent life and pay them the attention they needed when they needed it, that's not happening. You're not sick enough for us to deal with you yet. Stay on the list until you're worse. And actually, it makes the whole service a kind of, exercise in futility. It also makes it weirdly more expensive, because everything you're doing is very difficult and complicated, and people that you're dealing with are very, very sick. So we have this, need of the ruling class, because of their economic crisis, because of their need to wage war abroad and crush the anti-imperialist countries and pillage and loot their resources to try to inject profitability back into their own economies. You have this need to drive to war and therefore to militarize our societies and get people in a war mindset. So we have all of that you're talking about. Absolutely right. And the other thing you brought up was the question of the repression that we're seeing of the anti-Zionist, the Palestine solidarity movement at home. Now, we're seeing this again across imperialist countries, but I will talk specifically about Britain because it's the one I pay the most attention to. And I don't know if you're aware, Garland, you probably are, but this last weekend, there was another demonstration of people who were supporting Palestine Action in the sense that they were opposing the prescription of Palestine Action as a terrorist organization. Let us remember that although the government, with a stroke of the pen, said this is a terrorist organization and they are now proscribed, Palestine Action never terrorized anybody. The worst thing they did that really upset the ruling class was spray paint some fighter jets. So it's a symbolic act, but they broke into an RAF base to do it, which really upset everybody. And they sabotage, and they keep talking about millions of pounds worth of damage. And I personally feel, Garland, that this millions of pounds worth of damage just goes to show the way that the private providers of public services will rinse everything for every penny they can get. Because I do not believe that washing down some performative red paint of some planes costs millions and millions of pounds, unless it's coming from the same people who charge, £300 to change a light bulb in a hospital. So you understand me. So when they talk about all these millions of pounds worth of damage, I think it's nonsense. But even if it was, it's damage to 2 planes that are being used to help perpetrate a genocide, and that is not terrorism. It's not terrorism to try to stop a genocide. It's not terrorism to attack private property or even public property. You might say it's criminal damage at the very most. But then you can say, well, there's extenuating circumstances, and you can talk to the jury about what those circumstances are. And the reality is, when these people have been charged, these activists, when they've been charged with criminal damage in a court where they have a jury, the jury has listened to their case about the extenuating circumstances of wanting to help to stop a genocide, and they have been acquitting. Not always, but many times. So some Palestine Action activists have gone to jail, and others have been freed by juries who accept their argument that we are acting to prevent a genocide. And of course, the worse the genocide becomes, the more prone the juries are to accept this argument, right? Now, one of the things about prescribing Palestine Action means they don't have to have a jury trial. Terrorism offences are tried differently. Right, so straight away you bypass the jury and you can fast track people to jail if you want to. That's one thing. But this idea that support for terrorism can even come to, number one, they're not terrorists. And number two, I think it's an incredible misreading of law, actually, to say that someone who holds a piece of paper that says, I support Palestine Action, which basically means I believe that they are right to oppose the genocide, and also I am opposed to them being prescribed. Right? It doesn't mean they are activists. It doesn't mean they're paying supporters of that type. Right? They're literally saying it's not right to to prescribe this organization. For that offence, for sitting there holding a piece of cardboard, people are being arrested en masse in Britain. So 2 weeks ago, there was like 500 and something, mainly old people, arrested in Parliament Square and in other places in the country, but Parliament Square has been the big one. This last weekend, there were nearly 900 people arrested under the Terrorism Act. Nearly 900. Again, if you look at the pictures, a large proportion of them are elderly, retired people who've literally come there to say, this is ridiculous. We must defend our right to express these opinions, and we must defend the rights of the direct action group not to be prescribed as terrorists when they have not done anything which can possibly count as terrorism. And actually, there's something else I wanted to point out, Garland, that I find kind of two disturbing aspects to me about these demonstrations. One is the police are there arresting 900 people. And there's probably as many people standing around filming the arrests. And there are people shouting, shame. Oh, is this what you signed up for? Kind of, there's a level of animosity from the crowd towards the police. But what there isn't is any concerted, coordinated attempt to actually prevent the police from arresting these people. And it kind of tells you something about the mentality of the protesters and the kind of section of society they tend to come from, because I've seen footage of much more militant working class crowds just surrounding police vans until the police let the people go, right? I've seen them do it for people who've been arrested on as picked up because they're migrants who are being evicted, but they've been living here for years and they're part of a community. And I've seen the community kind of force the police to let them go. And I've also seen it, I think it was probably 2 years ago at the early part of the genocide. There was a big and very angry demonstration. I think it was in Manchester. And the police tried to pick up some people from that demonstration. And the crowd just surrounded the van and just would not let the van pass. And they were rocking the van until basically the police were, oh, shit, and they had to let the guys go. And nothing happened after that. So I find it disturbing that we have lost all sense of collective power. There was definitely enough people there to make the police think twice if they'd done more than just shout at them and hold up their telephones. But it doesn't even, it hardly feels like it occurs to people that we have this mindset that we're weak individuals. And that's really, again, something we need to think about. How do we overcome that? And for me, we've got to become class conscious. We've got to, study Marxism, join an organization, start to think like a class instead of like weak individuals. We are the ruling class wants us to think we're weak individuals, and our movement, the mass movement of the working class, whether it's the anti-war movement, the Palestine solidarity movement, the trade union movement, this layer of leadership of the working class has been bought off, and they amplify that message into the working class movement that we're all just weak individuals. They don't help us harness our collective strength in meaningful ways that help us learn how to use that strength that we actually have. We have a power, but we're not being helped to harness it and direct it. And we need to think about how we get rid of the leadership that ties us to this way of thinking, ties us to the Labour Party, ties us to imperialism, stops us actually from doing the things we want to be doing. It's really clear that there's a mass sense amongst a huge section of the population that's desperate to actually do something and to use the power that they sort of know that we have, but just have no experience of ever harnessing. And the other thing that I found, again, disturbing was just as 2 weeks ago, on the same day, there was in parallel a big Palestine solidarity demonstration that was just in a different bit, probably not that far away, of central London. And once again, I don't know how many people were on it. I know last time round there was like 750,000. I mean, imagine if they brought them all to Parliament Square and said, you will not arrest these people, right? But they didn't. And again, this time they didn't. So the leadership of the movement is deliberately keeping these struggles segregated, and they're allowing the state free rein to deal with them in separate ways, which of course is what the state wants. Now, if you're genuinely opposed to the genocide, don't you think you'd be thinking about how to stop the state managing your protest? You'd be thinking about how to make the protest work, right? But it's like they all cooperate. And so they let the people let off some steam by protesting, but in a way which is totally managed by the state, by the very force you're trying to push some influence onto. You're allowing them to control the way that you try to stop them. And fundamentally, the only way the British people are going to stop the British ruling class from its participation in these horrific crimes is by forcing them on the back foot and scaring them that we've got real power and we can do things that are going to disrupt, society and your ability to take profits, and we're going to do them. And we're going to stop your law machine from working. We're going to stop your money-making machine from working. That's the power that we have, and we're not being helped to use it by the leadership we have. And I find that really disturbing. There was another point I wanted to come back to. Oh yes, participation. So just to add on to that, I saw. I think his name is Matt Kennard. He's a journalist with a website in Britain called Declassified UK.
Yes, I've seen that before.
So they highlighted that evidence has come to light. Here again, we see another example of privatization, even of the war machine. But some fantastic evidence has come out because of it. So you know that Britain retains military bases, RAF bases, on the island of Cyprus. And these are crucial to British imperialist interests in domination of the Middle East and its oil reserves, right? So they won't let them go. They haven't let them go since Cyprus supposedly got liberation, but it turns out Cyprus never got liberation. It remains a kind of basically a colony of Anglo-American imperialism via various proxies. But there have been flights taking off every day from Cyprus. And the assumption is they're going over Gaza. Well, we know they're going over Gaza. The British government said, oh, we're just helping out to see if we can help find where the hostages are. They kind of frame it like that, like it's just a kind of peaceful humanitarian mission, right? But recently, it transpires that the British government, the British Army, the RAF, has outsourced some of its activity to a private company. And this private company, one of the pilots, forgot. So normally when the flights take off, they turn off their transponder over the Med before they hit Palestinian Israeli airspace, right? So you can't see where they go when they're over Palestine, Israel. But this one pilot, who's for the private outsourced company, didn't get the memo, left his transponder on. And so it was released, it was picked up that there was a picture of his flight path. round and round in circles over Khan Yunis refugee camp for 2 hours, which was a place where loads of fighting was going on. It's not a place where anyone's expecting there to be hostages. So quite clearly we have direct evidence, if it was needed, which people who study Anglo-American imperialism don't need more evidence, but for those who still need evidence, this is like a smoking gun that the British forces are directly involved in the genocide. Directly involved. Not just with sending money and weapons. It's not how many parts of an F-35 did you send last month. They're directly involved. And this, again, it reminds us that the Israelis are the attack dogs. They're not actually the brains behind this whole operation. This is directed by Washington and by London. This is Anglo-American imperialism's genocide, with Israel as the executive force on the ground, actually boosted by a lot of mercenaries. I think we also have to not forget that, right? But Israel is the main attack dog on the ground against Palestine in occupied Palestine. So this is something, again, really important to recognize. This is under a Labour government, right? Nothing changed. We went Tory to Labour. Nothing changed when it came to the genocide. In fact, Keir Starmer made it clear before he was elected that he was all in for Zionism. He was all in on the genocide. Nothing was going to change on his watch, right? That's part of his audition to be allowed to become prime minister. It's one of the conditions of the job. They have just, I will add this in, Garland, before I stop rabbiting on, sorry. But Keir Starmer had to have a reshuffle recently. There was a scandal in his cabinet. The deputy leader of the party had to resign. They had a quick reshuffle. Yvette Cooper, who was the Home Secretary in charge of banning Palestine action, has been shunted aside. And guess who's been put in her place? It's a nice Muslim lady. So now we have a Muslim in charge of Islamophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy by our government. And we have a Muslim lady in charge of the prescription and banning of all Palestine liberation organizations and even, civil disobedience organizations. And it's a Muslim lady who's in charge of suppressing the Palestine solidarity movement under the false charges of hate speech and terrorism support. So, I don't think it's going to change anything, but it's that classic case that we've talked about before, haven't we? Of the imperialists, try to dress up their criminality against oppressed peoples, against women, against all kinds of things by putting women and Black people at the front of their machinery of global destruction and pillage.
This is General Langley. He's in charge of AFRICOM. That's all you need to know. General Langley, he's in charge of making sure that those darn African Black people don't get any rights and don't get any access to their or in any way benefit from the natural resources that they've been so richly endowed with. They get none of it. And General Langley's the guy. And they have a woman in charge of Southcom, who is, Central and South America and all of that. So that's the game. Now we're going to have a Muslim in charge of. It's an old game too. It's an old game that they used in the colonial countries where they would just put some puppet in charge. They would have the king, the Queen's Riflemen or whatever in Nigeria, where they bring a bunch of Black local people, put a gun in their hand and say, make sure you shoot all of the uppity indigenous people that attempt to rise up. Your thoughts on darn, I had it and I didn't write it down. But at any rate, something I want to ask you about. I don't know if we've already touched a base on it, but it's there are a lot of people in the United States who, they've given up hope on the Democrats and blah, blah, blah. So up comes this guy, Mamdani or something, who's, I guess, also a Muslim guy who is running as a democratic socialist like Bernie and AOC. And now they're like talking about all the wonderful things that he's saying that he's going to do in New York, and kind of looks like he's going to win. And I keep saying, I don't trust him. And might I add, I looked into his wife. She's Syrian, but there's a weird thing about it is, so I start looking into his wife. She just like basically has nothing before 2022. Like she didn't exist. I'm an investigator. I know how to do an investigation of a person's background, right? She has no family. Everywhere you look, and it's like, okay, let's look into her family. And here's what it says about her family. It says she lived with her family in Dubai. That's it. If you look, her background and family, live with the family, nothing about her family, nothing about her history. And here's what's also interesting about the Mamdani's wife. It puts her down. It says that she's an activist for Palestinian rights. I can't find any quote from her. I can't find anything that she's ever attended on behalf of, any protests or anything. And here's what's weird. The first place she shows up is working with the BBC on a documentary. And she seems to be beloved by Reuters, the BBC, the Washington Post. They love her. She's involved with all this kind of stuff, and she does all this activism on women's rights and stuff like that, right? The usual, so the woke stuff. She's the wokest of woke artists. That's what she is. If you can't think of the wokest woke thing, that's what she's involved with. She kind of doesn't seem to have existed before 2022. She doesn't seem to have a family. And the Washington Post and Reuters and the BBC and all absolutely adore her. The only Palestinian activist in the history of this world that's absolutely beloved by Reuters, the BBC, the Washington Post, the New York Times. Not a bad word do they say about a Palestinian activist. And this is Mamdani's wife. And I'm like, I think there's spookery involved. That's just I don't know. But the suspicion of this Mamdani guy, I'm looking at his wife and I'm like, who is she? A Syrian activist. Nothing I can find about she said anything about Syria. A Palestine activist. Nothing. I mean, the label is there. Nothing exists about her. She's the invisible woman. Your thoughts on my suspicions about Mamdani and the invisible woman, also known as his wife, a beloved Palestinian activist.
Garland, I don't know how you got so cynical. I really don't. Well, it sounds to me a lot like Mr. Al-Jilani, doesn't it? He's got this weird biography that goes, he's definitely Syrian. He grew up in Saudi Arabia and popped up one day at the head of some organization that's definitely nothing to do with us, Gov. And he was a terrorist, and now he's our friend. Yes. I think you are right to be very suspicious about somebody whose biography looks like that. I have no doubt, if you look into it, that her position on Syria will be down with the evil dictator.
No, you won't, because there's absolutely nothing on her. She's from Syria. There's nothing. In fact, look at this. Dawaji, that's her notes in her Instagram bio, that she is from Damascus, Syria. However, according to the New York Times, a campaign spokesman said that Dawaji is ethnically Syrian, but was born in Texas. We don't even know if she is Syrian. She's a Syrian activist, but now we got multiple stories about she was born in Syria, she claimed, but then she was also born in Texas. Everything about her
doesn't add up, does it? What was I just about to say there? This getting points for being Syrian thing has become a new trend as well. I was at a trade union kind of jamboree in the West Country that happens every summer. And it's the first time I've been. It was quite an eye-opener. But I was on the stall. I didn't get to see this meeting, but my brother went over. They were having a meeting where they basically kind of astroturf, I think that's the word, isn't it? It's kind of they're trying to get trade union reps to all be on side with the idea that it is brilliant that the awful regime of dictator Assad has fallen, and now the important thing is to have connections with other trade unionists in the new revolutionary Syria, and we all need to support each other in an internationalist trade union solidarity way for workers' rights, right? And they did exactly the same thing, same type of campaigning through their kind of chosen trade unionists and chosen political leaders from Iraq after the war and occupation. After the occupation had begun, the British trade unionists started bringing over Iraqi trade unionists to help spread the imperialist kind of myth that it was a jolly good thing that Saddam Hussein had been got rid of. And now the focus was all on, let's help people have good workers' rights, because obviously they couldn't have those before. So went along to this meeting, and there was a guy there claimed to be speaking for Syria. And of course, it was all, along that. And he claimed he was Syrian. But then when he was questioned more closely, turned out he was Tunisian. So there's this, but the presentation of the meeting was all, yes, he's from Syria, so he can tell us all about the pain of the people and the struggle of the people against the evil Assad. And, this guy pops up and does the usual, carbon copy speech about the terrible situation before, and isn't it good we had a revolution? And it turned out that he's Tunisian. So they're doing this all over. I don't trust the little I've seen of what's going on in NYC, which I have to say is not that much, Garland, but particularly listening to your description of the guy, of his platform, of his associates, you definitely want to smell a rat, don't you? Now, I think you're seeing something similar in the USA than we're seeing here in Britain, which is massive working people are turning away from electoral politics in their droves. And they're turning away because they, for generations since World War II, bought into the idea, or even since the First World War, bought into the idea that the Conservatives and Labour are two real choices that give you different things. And if you vote Labour, you want to be with the working man. And if you vote Conservative, you're with, free enterprise and free markets and, this sort of mythology. Of course, working class people vote for both parties. Let's make that very clear. You can't be in government unless working class people have voted for you. But there was a belief in the system that it was a democracy and there were real choices. And the thing about the attack on post-war gains and the impoverishment of masses of workers is they've realized that it doesn't matter who you vote for, you get the same policies, you get the same wars, you get the same austerity. These people all serve the rich, they don't serve us, right? None of these people is making a difference to my life. Now, this is a good realization for the people to have, but it's causing a problem for the ruling class because increasingly people are not voting at all. Labour got this huge supermajority in Parliament in the last election because of the machinations of the ruling class to make sure all their opposition was basically destroyed at the time of the election, and there was no really good left-wing opposition to mess with them. So on just 18% of adult people in the UK voted for Keir Starmer's government. But he got a supermajority in Parliament because of all of the shenanigans of the ruling class to kind of set that up. We have a weird first past the post system that's very manipulable. But more than nearly half the people, not more than nearly half of the population did not vote at all, right? Now that's increasingly becoming a problem for the ruling class. And they want to, as well as they're preparing for unrest, they're also trying to find ways to herd people back into the system, to keep them believing there's a way to vote your way out of all these problems. And that if you just have the right leader or the right party or the right way of approaching electoral politics or the right story to tell people so they'll vote for you, you can use the system to make things better for working people in these current conditions. And of course, the truth is you can't, but the ruling class is trying to tell people you can. Now, because people are so disillusioned with the main parties, what we're now seeing is a kind of externalizing of their radical wings. So we basically, in Britain anyway, we have externalized the right wing of the Conservative Party into Reform with Nigel Farage. And now we're externalizing the left wing of the Labour Party into this new Your Party initiative under Corbyn and Sultana. And actually, if you look at this setup, it's exactly what's already happened in a lot of European countries. Social democracy collapsed in Italy, in France, in Greece, much earlier. They created left alternatives. But what has been the role of the left alternative every time has actually ended up being to prop up a mainstream government. What they have never done is actually face down the state. Think back to Syriza in Greece. You remember Syriza were elected to push back against austerity, pushed back against the EU. The Greek people wanted to get out of the EU. They wanted to say no to the Troika that was enforcing the most horrific austerity measures on them. They elected Syriza overwhelmingly. Syriza did a referendum. The Greek people voted, and then Syriza backed down. They didn't do what they were elected for. They didn't do what the people asked for in their referendum. They had everything behind them to do it, but they didn't do it. And we've seen that repeated again and again and again. What happened with the big so-called anti-fascist coalition against Le Pen, and it was anti-establishment against Macron in France? I'm losing track of time. I think it was last year, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was the year before. It feels like it was really recently. But what happened? They beat Macron. They could have they should have been set up a new government. The ruling class wouldn't allow them to. Then there was this whole thing about, oh my God, but Le Pen will get in. What did they do? They delivered all those votes to support Macron. When the whole point had been a massive.
Macron had started a new party. When Macron came to power, he started a new party, and they were like, wow, this is amazing. Things were falling apart. Macron has this new party in I forgot how many months, and it rose to power. So it was the same game. They bring in Macron, and Macron says, yes, we've got a new party, and everybody's amazed how fast it rises to power. They deliver the same thing, if only worse. What happens? A new coalition has to be dealt with. We come up to deal with Macron. That rises to power. It keeps Macron. Go to Ukraine. Everything's going to heck. What do? They come up with a television show called Servant of the People. And there's a star by the name of Vladimir Zelensky. And in the TV show, this teacher becomes president who wants to take Ukraine into the EU and NATO. And what do you know? The Servant of the People party pops up. And the star of the show is now the presidential candidate. And what does he run on? Peace with Russia. He gets in, and what does he do? He does a 180. They did the same thing in Ukraine. What was it? The brothers Maloney, the brothers party or whatever? Over and over and over, all they say is things are going terrible. We're going to create this new political alternative. They just want to get it in power. As soon as it gets in power, there's your new alternative. When that goes bad, there's an alternative to the alternative to the alternative, and it's alternative parties all the way down.
And it's just keeping us busy, isn't it, Garland? And one of the things I find particularly egregious about the people on the left, the Trotskyists and the left Social Democrats and the Greens and all these people who are running around trying to make this into a big thing and trying to convince workers to support it, like it's the solution to all their problems. What I find really egregious about that is these crimes, these problems that are facing workers are desperate, they're urgent, they're immediate. The housing crisis is getting worse day by day right now. Okay, the cost of living crisis and inflation is getting worse day by day right now. The ruling class is trying to open up new fronts of its world war right now. The genocide is happening live streamed to our phones right now, and they run around in front of us going, oh, we can, yes. It's still elections are going to fix it, and what we need is to build up this new party for the 2029 general election. You're like, 2029? Are you effing kidding me? That's the best. That is your solution to the working class. Not let's organize, not let's get rid of this useless layer of leaders who have sold us out, reclaim our mass organizations and do something, build something now to act with urgency to solve our problems and stop these terrible crimes, stop this terrible war drive that's throwing, getting ready to throw the huge masses of workers under the bus and into a meat grinder, right? None of that. No. Just sign up to your mailing list and go along to a local meeting where we all say our wish lists for how we wish the world would be one day and promise to build a party that will get Jeremy Corbyn elected in 2029. It's farcical, Garland. It's absolutely farcical. And especially considering everything we've seen about Jeremy Corbyn and everything you said about how these constant new alternatives actually work. Nigel Farage is doing the Donald Trump thing of saying, oh, the real problem is immigrants and I'll fix that. And of course, he's done the same thing as Maloney, which is when he was far away from power, he was also very anti-NATO. He was quite pro-Russia. He was against the Ukraine war. He said all kinds of rebellious things that go down well with working people. The closer he gets to power, when he's getting in, there's a possibility he might become prime minister. And now he's auditioning seriously. And now the ruling class is disciplining him about all the things that he's got to get on message about. And guess what? He jumps into line on every single one of them, just like Maloney did. Maloney was elected to be anti-immigrant because they've told workers that that's the reason they've got a bad life is the immigrants, and anti-war because the wars are really unpopular with the mass of the working class. The first thing that happened was she toned down all of her anti-war rhetoric and got full on board with NATO. Exactly opposite of what she promised people. So they do, and then they do performative anti-immigration stuff. So they basically, it becomes a disciplining campaign. They're not actually going to evict all the immigrants because, number one, their economy can't do without them. Number two, they were lying to you. Number three, they actually need to keep the anti-immigrant hysteria going, to keep workers divided, and to keep immigrant labor, which, let's not forget, is the most exploitable and cheapest labor, disciplined. If there's a constant anti-immigrant furore and hype, the immigrants are scared. The mass of the workers accept the scapegoating of the migrants. They are scared and isolated and feel weak and unprotected and unable to stand up for themselves and scared that they're going to be deported or jailed or whatever horrible thing might happen to them. So they will accept terrible working conditions and not make a fuss about it. So it's like a disciplining process. So it's, none of this is about making conditions better for the working class, which is what they stand on their podiums and tell desperately angry and impoverished and disenfranchised workers. They tell them that's what they're doing, but it's not what they're doing. They have no intention of addressing the root causes of the problems for workers. This is all a hype campaign, like you said, just to keep them engaged in the system, to bring them back from total rejection of electoralism and bourgeois politics back into hoping that there is a way through the ballot box to make this change after all.
Well, it reminds me of this. The United States ended up with a civil war. Why is that? Part of it was slavery, but I can give you two instances. One was on the eastern shore of Maryland, where some woman beat a teenage slave girl to death. There were some local Quakers who were very anti-slavery, and they went to court. And, of course, the court ruled that they own the slaves. You can't do anything, right? They went to court. We're going to go to the system to say there's an injustice, right? John Brown. What happened with John Brown? John Brown worked in Kansas and said, we're going to stop the slavery expanding into the new territories, which, of course, they were killing the Native Americans to the new territories. In other words, the new stolen land that we've just massacred people on. Maybe we'll try to get justice from the system there. So what do? They do all these things to pass laws, and the slave owners send in a bunch of thugs and they beat people and kill people. You can look up Bloody Kansas. That's what it was called. And John Brown then says, you know what? We've tried everything legally. There's nothing that we can do. We're going to have to fight the system. And everybody knows the John Brown thing, but which a lot of people feel eventually led to the Civil War. But here's my point, because I saw someone in the chat, and I mean, genuinely, I understand, say, can't we sue the government? You're going to go to the government to sue the government. That, number one, you still believe that they have rules. Right now, there's a guy who is named Duterte, a guy that I'm not thrilled with, but let me just say this. He is the former Philippine president. When he was doing a lot of stuff that the U.S. said, and he was, doing all kinds of terrible things. The U.S. didn't say a word about it. Now, recently, with the new Filipino puppet, Duterte comes out and says, look, I don't think this is a good idea, what we're doing with China. It's bad for the Philippines. He's more of a nationalist. We need to look out for the Philippines and not be cannon fodder. All of a sudden, they decide they're now going to prosecute him for the things that he did when he was president that the U.S. supported. They take him to The Hague. He's a prisoner. He's going to be tried for what? For summarily executing people that he claimed were drug dealers, which I oppose, of course. So what does Trump do the other day? Summarily executes a bunch of people who he claims were drug dealers, which the story makes no sense at all. But my point is, that just goes to show the system We're okay with what you do until you go against what we want, and then we're going to put you in jail for doing what we will do with impunity. So the idea that you could use the system to take the system out, you could vote for Mondani, he's going to come in, maybe Macron, maybe this new coalition of this person or that person. The system doesn't abide by rules, and the only rules that it has are rules to uphold itself, which will be used against you.
100%, Garland. We've talked about this before as well, haven't we? You know, we are brought up to have a superstitious reverence for the law and the justice system, like it came from on high, from the Lord Almighty, out of a blue sky, and not to understand that it's a product of class forces and the balance of class forces, and the extent to which you can use the judicial system to right any wrong is fundamentally a reflection of what are the balance of class forces at any one time. But ultimately, the justice system is a part of the machinery of state. And the machinery of state is a machine in the hands of the ruling class, the exploiting class. And its job is to keep the exploited down. That is the job of the system. And fundamentally, the rules are there to make us believe that the system is somehow good for everybody, to keep the lid on. One of the roles of the state is to keep a lid on open class warfare, because, you know, society has been divided ever since the time of ancient slavery thousands of years ago. Society has been divided into two main classes, exploiters and exploited. And without a state machinery, you would have open class warfare pretty much all the time. So part of the state machine's job is not just to hold down the oppressed, but to hold them down in such a way that the whole thing seems to them sort of natural and inevitable, and they get the impression that the state machinery is something neutral, but it isn't. I would ask everybody to read The State and Revolution. It's a small pamphlet by Lenin, written in 1917 on the eve of the October Revolution, and he was helping the workers there to understand why it is that they are going to have to overthrow and destroy the capitalists' state machine, because it's there to do a particular job, and we can't make it serve us because we don't want to do that job. We don't want to become a minority exploiting class. So the machine that's been perfected to keep a tiny minority in power over the majority, to keep exploiters in power over exploited, that's no use to us. That's why we have to overthrow and destroy, dismantle the state machine that exists right now, not to have anarchy, to build a new state, a state where the majority of the people are the ruling class. That's a totally different job that state has to do. And so it's a very different machine. It's a much smaller machine, because the people you're trying to keep down now are dispossessed exploiters, people whose wealth we've taken off them and who want to get it back. They have to be kept down, Garland. We're not making our revolution just to let them take it back again, right? So it will be a machine of repression, but it's of the vast majority versus the minority. It's a machine whose job is to build a society where in the future no machine will be necessary at all. But that's a transition period that for a time the state is necessary. So, you know, the workers' state will be necessary after the revolution, and authoritarian measures against those who want to restore capitalism will be necessary. But the real monstrous edifice of repression that we see now as the bourgeois state, the capitalist state, machinery of control, that needs to be smashed and got rid of, because it's absolutely in the way. And we have to get over this superstition that we have, that the state is something neutral, something that's kind of God-given. There was a time in human history where no society had a state machine. They didn't need one, because they lived and made their decisions, you know, consensually and in cooperative ways. And there will be a time in the future where humanity doesn't need a state also. But right now, we have to deal with the state that exists. It's a machinery that's been, as I said, developed and perfected over hundreds and even thousands of years to maintain a tiny exploiting class over a majority of exploited people. And that's what it's for. It's not there to deliver justice for everybody. And justice can never be equal in a society where, you know, the mass of the people don't have secure housing or food or jobs or any access to media or political power, and a tiny minority of people control literally everything. How can you possibly have equality or justice between those people? I know just from looking at small cases, for example, access to the law. You know, since we have had our legal aid system destroyed as part of the attacks on the welfare state, we're once more returning to a kind of Dickensian situation, or a Victorian situation that was documented by Dickens, where the poor have no access to the law, none at all, because you have to pay. And how can there be justice when, I mean, think about the cases of, what is it, deny, defend, depose, you know, the strategy of the corporate giants of healthcare delivery, so-called, in the USA. What is the insurers, their strategy for not paying out to people who have health insurance? Their strategy is to use the law because they have more access to the law than the person at the other end. How do you right that kind of injustice? You know, if you try to, you can put all your effort, all your energy, you'll spend your life force and get loads of other people to do the same, but you won't fix a thing. You will just keep yourself busy on and say you got justice for one person who's been wronged by a warped legal system or you know, misuse of laws that are not supposed to work that way. Okay, but with their money, people warp the outcomes of the justice system. That's not fair. It shouldn't be that way. So we can either spend our time fighting for justice, say you do a massive campaign for justice, and 50 years later you get it. What did you get? You might get an apology. You might get recognition that something bad happened. You might even get a little bit of damages. That's 50 years of your life and the life of all the people who campaigned. And the system remains. And through that 50 years, every day there were more miscarriages of justice. There were more warpings of the machinery by money versus not money. And the idea that we fight for justice inside the system is just fundamentally wrong. And what we have to do is learn our lesson and put our energy and our life force into something that can actually bear fruit, which is the building the movement that will change society and not just try to fix this old society which can't be fixed.
Joti Brar, tell everyone where they can find you and all your works.
Thank you, Garland. So Joti Brar is my name and is the name of my Telegram channel. The Communists is the name of my party's Telegram channel, and our website is thecommunists.org, and you can see the URL there. We have a YouTube channel which is really excellent called Proletarian TV, and we have a shop on our party website where you can buy our publications. And I especially encourage people to subscribe to our newspapers, physical newspapers. As I always say to people, physical literature is much better for learning from than electronic device reading. You just get much more out of it. We've got a new print machine now, so our print quality is going up, which is making me very happy. And finally, I would just remind people that what you really need to be doing is getting organized. So if you're in Britain, get in touch with our party, become a supporter, become a candidate member, start to get yourself part of the solution. And wherever you live in the world, start studying. On our website, you can find a Marxist education program, and you can start working your way through that and start to understand how this system really works and what it is we really need to be fighting for.
Everyone, Joti Brar. And last but not least, on the way out, we always have to have a word from Keir Starmer. Thanks, everyone. Make sure you share this on all your social media platforms.